Hello, everyone, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, Principles of Humanity Under Pressure, the Geneva Conventions at 75 and the Future of International Humanitarian Law. My name is Maisha Alam, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator today. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to the International Committee of the Red Cross for helping make this event possible. 75 years ago, the signatories to the Geneva Conventions established binding rules on the protection of civilians and combatants in armed conflicts that remain legal obligations today. While the importance of the 1949 Geneva Conventions is widely recognized, they are not universally respected. Civilians continue to be killed, wounded, sexually assaulted, and forced to flee their homes in conflict. Meanwhile, the nature of warfare is becoming ever more complex, with new technologies deployed in actual and virtual battlefields, the complicated web of proxy warfare, and a proliferation of battle in urban centers. This discussion, coinciding with Protection of Civilians Week, brings together expert leaders and changemakers to explore how the conventions can remain fit for purpose in armed conflicts today and into the future. And of course, I'm sure I'm not the only one with questions. We also want to hear from you, our audience, tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. Here's how to write to us. If you're watching the live stream on our website, click the button below to submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing for. If you're joining us on social media, you can chime in by tagging @foreignpolicy, or you can email us your questions to events@foreignpolicy.com. All right, let's get started. I'm honored to start our program with Mirjana Spoljaric-Egger, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Welcome, Mirjana. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Maisha. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. I'd love to start this conversation by just reminding people a little bit about the Geneva Conventions and what they are and why they're still so important. And so let me ask you this. International humanitarian law is a compromise between military necessity and humanity. How do the conventions balance that tension?
First of all, let me start by thanking you for organizing this event. I think it's a very timely moment to speak about these issues because we all know that the Geneva Conventions do not prevent war. But the Geneva Conventions are designed to preserve humanity in times of conflict. Now, what does that mean, given that they don't quantify how many casualties are allowed and, humanly acceptable in a situation of war? What we clearly can say is, preserving humanity means that war cannot be led with the objective of a victory at all cost, because it means dehumanizing the other side. And it means, that whatever happens to the civilian population is acceptable because the ultimate objective legitimizes the civilian cost. What the Geneva Conventions also do, apart from preventing this victory at all costs and dehumanizing of the other, to preserve humanity and to protect civilian lives, they also clearly prohibit certain things at all situations in all times, like rape, like torture, like taking hostages, for instance, or deliberately targeting civilians. But what we also have to say that today, more and more, given what is happening in the world and in these different situations of conflict that we are witnessing today, is that states have no excuse to use international humanitarian law today to justify civilian death. On the contrary, they should uphold IHL as their political priority, not only according to the letter of the law, but also to the spirit of the law. Because what we see now, and we will speak about this more, is that the new means of warfare allow for massive casualties within a very limited amount of time. Now, is this allowed, even though IHL doesn't quantify how much is allowed or not allowed? No, it's not, because the spirit of the law is to minimize civilian death and to minimize civilian casualties at all times.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate you alluding to that exact challenge of the nature of warfare and the ways in which a variety of technologies have only increased in many ways the risks to civilians. And we'll come back to it in a second. But I wanted to pick up on something else that you were talking about, and that relates to compliance. And, the conventions were universally adopted and ratified with strong international consensus at that time. So, what has changed since their original signing to today?
I mean, a lot of things have changed since 1949. What we see today is a compilation of global trends, challenging trends. So you don't only have an escalation of conflict. 25 years ago, my predecessor spoke of 20 situations of armed violence. We classify over 120 situations today. What has also changed is the relationship between, other trends like climate change, poverty, rising inequalities, and the increase of situations of armed violence. So you cannot tackle situations of violence alone without looking at the context, which leads also to the situation where we today can say every time a conflict starts, we're there to stay for a long time, because protractedness in these circumstances increases. And then, of course, you have the element of new technology, artificial intelligence, completely changing the weapons and the way they are employed. But at all times, IHL remains valid. There's no reason, in spite of all these challenges, to question the validity of international humanitarian law. And this is important. And it is even less a reason to question the spirit of the law, which remains to protect civilian lives.
Thank you. I appreciate all of those points about the validity, the universality, and also, what you touched on with respect to the compounding challenges and the convergence of those that are making the work that you all do see only more complex. And so when we talk about, what does the implementation and compliance and practice of the conventions look like, I wanted to ask you about the importance of neutrality, and specifically of the ICRC when it comes to supporting parties in conflict. Can you help us understand why is neutrality critical for compliance with IHL and to, as you put it, reduce human suffering?
Neutrality per se is not a precondition, as far as I can see it. It's not a precondition for compliance with IHL, because compliance with IHL essentially is the obligation of states, of the state parties to the Geneva Conventions, but of all parties to a conflict. So it's not that we demand neutrality of states in situations of armed conflict. They take sides. That's normal. They're supposed to take sides almost in order to protect their own interests and the interests of their population and to protect their population. But because states know that they would always take sides, it's in their nature, they created the ICRC. They created the concept of humanitarian neutrality to allow other actors to interfere and maintain a channel of communication at all times, and to not and to preserve that human aspect of a human life is a human life, meaning to preserve entities that not only can communicate at all times, but also can bring help to everybody who needs it. And through this neutrality, not only maintain the ability to interfere in active situations of armed violence and of military operations, but also to continue building trust and to continue providing first steps back to political negotiations towards peace and stability. Because if we renounced on entities like the ICRC, we would lose that capacity to keep the door open a little bit to be able to return back to peace. Because I'm coming back to the original notion of why IHL exists. It exists to prevent victory at all costs. It exists to dehumanize the other. And in order to remind everybody at all times, and in order to maintain that possibility to come back to the negotiation table, because we haven't destroyed humanity, the ICRC was created. If you take that neutrality away from us, we are deprived of the underpinnings of fulfilling our mandate.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And, there's so many things that we could discuss further. And as I'm listening to you speak, a couple stand out in particular. One is the emphasis, rightfully, that you're placing on the role of states and their responsibility, right, to comply. And then the other is, of course, about the unprecedented levels of armed conflict that we're seeing in the world, and the ways in which those conflicts are being fought are affecting communities for, not just in the immediate moment but for so long afterwards. And so you touched on this a little bit earlier, and I'd like to come back to it, which is about the changing nature of war, the future of war, and the role of emerging technologies. And I should say, we were at FP really honored to have you contribute to a report that we published last year, Digital Frontlines on Hybrid Warfare and on the role of emerging technologies in armed conflict and the protection of civilians, of course. And so let me ask you this specifically, which is, can you help us understand what are the threats and challenges that you face amidst the changing nature of war in the digital age? So, for example, how do mis and disinformation campaigns or cyber operations complicate your work in conflict zones and undermine not only, compliance with IHL, but your ability to protect humanity and to, as you have put it so eloquently, prevent victory at all costs?
Thank you, Maisha. Let me come back to the previous points. Why was IHL created? It's to protect humanity to the extent possible and to minimize civilian casualties and civilian loss and civilian suffering. Now, for this, we need neutral humanitarian actors. We need, the acceptance that we want to uphold the principle of the protection of civilians prevails at all times, no matter what happens. And we want to protect the principle of, this has been designed because protecting humanity and upholding, the notion that a human life is a human life is enshrined in all cultures, religions, in all countries, in all societies. Hence, the fact that the Geneva Conventions were ratified by all states and constitute still today one of the strongest universal consensus. Now, this consensus is not broken or questioned because of climate change or because of new technologies. So the law applies. Protecting humanity applies no matter what happens around it and no matter how much the context changed. So nothing serves as an excuse to say, oh, IHL doesn't apply because we have new technologies, we have cyber. Cyber is a different, era. So we have to reinvent IHL. No, IHL applies. But everything we do today and everything we see today in the humanitarian field is linked to digital transformation and to the fast development of new technologies, meaning we have to adapt. On one hand, we have to understand how IHL applies in terms of how can we ensure in the cyberspace the critical infrastructure remains protected? Because we know now that through cyber means, you can faster and more remotely destroy civilian infrastructure at scale. We also know that artificial intelligence risks, removing the human accountability in situations of conflict. You can potentially transfer the decision over life and death to a machine, to an algorithm. But that is not according to the spirit of the law. You can also use artificial intelligence to broaden the scope of your operations within a relatively limited amount of time. You can accelerate military decisions to an extent where they surpass the cognitive capacity of a human being, eliminating the possibility to maintain human responsibility and accountability at all times, which is essential in terms of compliance with IHL. And last but not least, you have misinformation and disinformation through these new platforms that spreads much faster and creates a reality in the perception of the people that becomes very dangerous, not only for the civilians, but also for our staff, for humanitarian personnel overall. That's just a few examples. What you also see is a blurring of the lines between military actors, private actors, individuals, etc., etc. So what we need to is discuss in the future how we can ensure compliance given these different developments, where we need new normative frameworks because the new developments require a stricter approach to what needs to be prohibited at all times to preserve compliance with IHL. And then what we also need is to address more and more actors and make them aware that if they get involved in certain situations by using certain tools, they're blurring the line between civilians and military actors, and thus are also endangering the level of protection that civilians enjoy in situations of armed conflict. So there are many, many things we need to look at. We've been investing a lot over the past years in bringing things up to date. We are working with states in order to promote compliance with IHL, given these new challenges, and they move quickly, they develop quickly. So we urge states to really move ahead and take this very seriously.
Thank you for all of that. And it is so complex, and I appreciate you outlining those various considerations, but to underscore the point that you were making, which is that IHL remains valid no matter. And I'd love to, I know we're running up against time, but I'd love to bring in one audience question that we've received, and maybe we can take this very quickly, Mariana. There's a question from I think it's Belgin San Akça. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, from Koç University in Istanbul, who asks, what are some legal mechanisms to make non-state armed groups comply with, humanitarian law, and how do we make sure that those are in place and that is upheld as well? So maybe you want to very quickly just provide us your perspective on that, Mariana.
Thank you. I would not go into details here because much more knowledgeable people about IHL will speak in the course of this session, and I don't want to say anything wrong here. But fact is, the primary obligation for the compliance with IHL, for the implementation of IHL, lies with states. But that doesn't eliminate the obligations for non-state armed groups, other individuals, other groups, other entities and segments to comply with IHL. There's customary law, there's a wide set of rules that applies to everyone in a situation of armed conflict that needs to be respected. So the International Committee of the Red Cross maintains a dialogue with roughly 250 armed groups around the globe. This proves that, given the prevalence of non-international armed conflicts, we have to invest every day in making sure that no matter what your entity is called or considers itself, you know the rules and you know that you are under equal obligation to protect civilian lives, as are national armies. And fact is also, in the majority of territories where we work nowadays, the totality of the territory is normally not controlled by one entity and definitely not by state-owned entities.
Indeed. And I know at least some of our panelists in the next segment have experience both as scholars and practitioners grappling with exactly those challenges about non-state armed groups. So maybe we can come back to it. But Mirjana, let me thank you so much for your insights, for taking part in this program, and of course, for your leadership at the ICRC during very, very challenging times. Thank you, Mirjana.
Thank you, Maisha. Thank you very much.
I'm now pleased to welcome an illustrious group of panelists to delve deeper into some of the issues that we've been discussing today. First, we have Ona Hathaway, Professor of International Law at Yale Law School, where she is also the director of the Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges. Welcome, Ona. We also have Hichem Khadraoui, newly minted executive director of the Center for Civilians and Armed Conflict, or CIVIC. Hichem, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And finally, General Stanley McChrystal, co-founder of the McChrystal Group and retired U.S. Army general, who was previously commander of U.S. Forces and International Security Assistant Forces, or ISAF, in Afghanistan, and also of the Joint Special Operations Command. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for participating in today's discussion. I'd love to pick up where we left off with Mirjana and turn first to you, Ona, and ask you this. The 1949 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols were designed and adopted by the international community to regulate conduct in armed conflict. But compliance over the last several decades have been far from universal, and certainly as we can see today in Gaza, Ukraine, and in so many other places. Why does this matter for the protection of civilians, for the rights of the injured and prisoners of war, and for the preservation of critical infrastructure?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for holding this conversation. So the Geneva Conventions are lengthy. Those who are watching may have read them. If you haven't, I encourage you to take a look at them. They're on the ICRC's website. There's lots of rules attached, but underneath them, there's sort of three critical principles under the Geneva Conventions and customary international law of international humanitarian law. And those three critical principles are the principle first of distinction. So this idea that the use of armed force has to distinguish between those who are proper military targets, that is combatants, and civilians. And that civilians should not be the intentional target of use of military force. And then the second principle is proportionality. Now, this one's actually a pretty complex principle, but in short, basically the idea is that prohibits the use of force that can be expected to cause excessive civilian collateral damage in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated from the strike. So in other words, we recognize, the conventions recognize that sometimes when you're targeting a legitimate military objective, there may be some civilians that are in the way, and you're not prohibited from attacking the military objective in those instances, but the harm to civilians and civilian objects can't be excessive in relation to the military objective. And then the third principle is precaution, which is basically the idea that parties of the conflict have to take all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population and civilian objects under their control against the effects of attack. So these are the central ideas. And all of them are really motivated by this critical principle that was emphasized in the earlier part of the conversation, which is the importance of doing everything reasonable to protect civilians in the course of conflict. And the central idea behind the Geneva Conventions and modern international humanitarian law is exactly that, is recognize that there are sometimes going to be conflicts. There's a whole other set of rules about preventing war. The UN Charter prohibits the use of military force. There's lots of rules that prohibit the use of military force. But nonetheless, there's a recognition conflict will happen. And when it does, there should be every effort made to protect civilians from the effects of that conflict. It's not going to be able to be perfect, and the principle of proportionality recognizes that. Nonetheless, combatants are expected to take reasonable efforts to try and protect civilians. So your question was, what goes wrong when those rules are not followed? Well, the obvious problem is that when those rules are not followed, civilians suffer, and civilian objects are destroyed. Civilian objects, people's homes, water treatment plants, the basic infrastructure that people rely on for their lives. When those things are destroyed, it makes it very hard for civilians to carry on their lives. Now, it's important to emphasize that a lot has gone right. I don't want to suggest, and I don't want our listeners to take away from this, like, what's the point of the Geneva Conventions? There's all these violations. And certainly when you read the newspapers focus on the problems. They focus on the conflicts. They focus on the things that have gone wrong. They focus on the horrible events that have unfolded. It's important to remember, every state that is party to the United Nations is also party to all of the Geneva Conventions. The states take significant effort to try and actually follow these critical principles. And yet, nonetheless, we can point to lots of cases where those rules have not been followed. The war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, there's lots of instances where civilians are being caught in the middle of the conflict. And so, part of our project as international lawyers, I'm an international lawyer, not everyone here is to try and do what we can to try and reinvigorate those principles and make them more effective.
Thank you. And I appreciate, the both kind of level setting and the reality, but also saying that there has been important progress made as well, and that we shouldn't lose total sight of that either. And I really appreciate you walking us through those overarching principles that underpin the legal frameworks that we're talking about. And I'd love to turn next to Stan and ask you a little bit about what all of this looks like in practice. Now, you've commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. So help us understand what adherence to the Geneva Conventions looks like on the battlefield. And what are some of your lessons learned for how to uphold IHL on the ground?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And just because rules are imperfectly followed doesn't mean we don't need to have them. In fact, it makes them more important than ever. And what I'd like to do is break it at two levels. If you think of war on the ground with soldiers. Now, I was able to teach for 12 years at Yale after I retired, and imagine arming all the freshmen with high-powered weapons and then sending them out to do something. And that's kind of what armies are. It's young people. They are led by slightly older people, and they are held together by discipline. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was against the rules informally to shoot the officers of an opposing army because you didn't want that army to become a mob, because you knew that an ill-disciplined mob was worse than an enemy army. And so if you think about what happens, war is emotional at the lowest level. You see your friends hurt. You are frustrated by booby traps. You're frustrated. So two levels have got to occur at that. First, you've got to spend a lot of effort educating the force on the moral part of it and why they should do it. And then you've got to understand that at times of high emotion, that's when we are sort of least rational. You need discipline. You need non-commissioned officers and officers who absolutely will hold people. It's like holding your friend back when they want to get in a fight or something like that. And armies have got to do that, particularly when they're provoked by really exceptionally violent things by the other side, as some terrorist groups will do. Then there's another level. There's a policy level. And that's different. That's normally made in warm, dry rooms. And if we think at the beginning of the Second World War, every nation said that they would not use air power, which they thought was going to be very effective, to bomb civilians. Every nation said we won't do it. And by a year into the war, every nation's doing it, and we took it to an art form. And so as you get, even at the policy level, as you get toward this idea of we can't afford to lose, there is this almost a gravitational pull that pulls every nation and every group towards doing whatever it takes to win, or at least not to lose. And so this is, again, where laws matter so much, because you have to force people to think there's going to be a day after the war, and we're going to want to be in the international community. Also, one of the great things the rules does is you don't want to do things that your opponents will then be licensed to do. And so, again, it's not perfect, no laws are, but it keeps this inherently disorganized violence in some kind of control. And I think that's about the best we can do. That's why I think it's so important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there's so much that you covered, and one particular comment that you just made that harkens back to the discussion that we were having with Mariana, which is that these laws and the principles are not just about what happens in wartime. Of course, yes, but they're as much also about what happens the day after. And I think this is something that Mariana was alluding to as well, and I think is important for everyone to remember. Hisham, I'd love to bring you into the conversation at this point. And, we've been talking a lot about, whose responsibilities these laws are and what it takes to uphold them. And, the question I wanted to put forward to you is, what is the role of civil society organizations in, at this point, reinvigorating respect for the Geneva Conventions, even if the responsibility to uphold IHL falls primarily with states, as Mariana was emphasizing earlier, and with armed groups? How do organizations like yours, Civic, work alongside others to make sure that the Geneva Conventions exist not just in principle, but also in practice? Hisham, I think you might be on mute.
You hear me now?
Yes, great.
Great.
There you go.
I was saying thank you very much, FP, because I'm in New York for the POC week, and it's extremely timely opportunity to discuss about that. First and foremost, on your first question, today we are witnessing a time of defiance and mistrust towards states, the West, the UN, the international community, as we used to call it. And NGOs can play an extremely critical role in being the glue between communities in conflicts, armed actors that are having this narrative that we are witnessing right now, and the states and other organizations. NGOs are sometimes better positioned to revigorate respect of international humanitarian law. But for that, we need two conditions. First of all, NGOs should be principled in a sense that they should act in the principle of neutrality and impartiality and walking the talk. Because on the ground, when I was living in conflict zones, armed actors, armed groups, communities are watching us. They are watching the way NGOs are behaving. So we could play a positive role if we assume as well the fact that we should be let's say, far away from political debates or choosing sides. I think this is extremely important. Another thing, we need to be well-educated. Civil society organizations, if we want to play a role in respecting IHL, we need to have then the necessary knowledge amongst NGOs to talk about international humanitarian law. I saw too many instances where you have NGOs that are fearing to engage with armed groups, with armed actors on the very basics rules of IHL because they don't know about it. They think that it is illegal even for them to engage with armed groups, for example. They are fearing counter-terrorist measures. They are fearing potential sanctions. They think it's illegal. While we know that Article 3 talks about that, it is perfectly legal to engage with parties to conflict on humanitarian issues. So I think this is extremely important that we need in the NGO community to embrace IHL and to not see it from a very far away and complex topic. Enlarging the scope of organizations involved as well in making IHL respected. Today, I think Mariana talked about that. If you only rely on the ICRC, on the civics, and a couple of others, we can't. I mean, we see the numbers, 120 armed conflicts worldwide, more and more are coming. So we need to have a coalition that is inclusive enough of actors that are engaged on these topics. And I want to talk about the local actors on the ground, the local civil society actors, and the non-Western international NGOs. This is an extremely important point. I was in Iraq, I was in Afghanistan, I was in Yemen. Always the same thing is that IHL is for the West and is made by the West. It's not true, but this is like the principle. So we need as well to engage with non-traditional organizations, non-Western organizations as well, and to make them as well coming into the boat in terms of IHL engagement. And so this is for the first question. On your second question, civic, or how we do it, how we work to make sure that the Geneva Conventions are existing in practice and in reality. First of all, we adopt a realistic and pragmatic approach. If we come from a dogmatic point of view, or always or only sticking to, let's say, the formalized and codified Geneva Conventions, it won't work. I'll give you an anecdote. I met with Taliban leaders, and one Taliban leader told me why I should respect books that were made in Geneva by people that I have no clue and no link about. And the link he talked about was tribal link, religious link, social link. These are links that are crucial for most of the communities and actors where conflicts are appearing right now. And we need as well to embrace this notion of how we can bridge this gap. So when we engage civic with the security forces, for example, we talk about at the tactical level, we talk about the fact that they are disciplined, as the general said about it. It will bring and yield effective results in the way they are waging war, and not talking about principles, but about really effective, concrete gains on the day-to-day basis. We work as well through policy changes. So we review their policies, their POC policies. However, here we are inclusive in the way we review them. We include local customary rules, religious norms, traditions, unwritten rules, and it's extremely important. So there's a show of respect. At the end of the day, civics wants to bring back IHL to where it belongs, to the conflict zones, and not in the nice salons and spheres of Geneva and the Genevas of the world. When it comes to communities, same thing, and I will finish by that. They are accountable as well. A civilian taking up weapons lose its status of protection of civilians. So we engage with them in strengthening their self-protection mechanisms, and as well making sure that they understand as well the accountability, and being a civilian means to not get involved in fighting activities. At the end of the day, civics wants to create bridges between armed actors and civilian communities to improve the protection of civilians. Thank you.
Thanks, Hichem. I appreciate all of that. And I realize I did kind of ask you a couple of questions. So that was me being excited about having you on this call. But let me pick up on some things that you said and also turn back to you, Ona. And you know, we've heard a lot about the importance of it, how to do it, but we know that it doesn't always happen, and that is the reality that we face. And so let me ask you, you know, what needs to change to ensure armed groups compliance? And specifically, what is the role of multilateral institutions in enforcement? What about the role of accountability mechanisms, for example, the International Criminal Court? Can you tell us a little bit more about how that, if you will, fits into the picture?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that. I mean, obviously, a critical part of compliance with international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions in particular is states doing the kind of hard work that Stan was mentioning about ensuring that they discipline and educate their forces, and they have mechanisms in place to ensure that the rules are being followed. But of course, states are not the only ones involved in conflict. And those states that care about the rules are not the only ones involved in conflict. So one thing that hasn't been mentioned thus far that I think is critically important is the role of states in holding their partners to account. So states, many states that are engaged in conflict have other state partners or other non-state partners, and many of the non-state actors that are engaged in conflict around the world receiving weapons, are receiving financial assistance, are receiving intelligence, are receiving training from states that are party to the Geneva Conventions. And there are rules that govern the responsibility of states for other parties, both state and non-state actor parties. Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions requires that states not only respect the Geneva Conventions, but that they ensure respect of the Geneva Conventions. And that's properly read, in my view, and view of many international lawyers and view of the ICRC, properly to include a responsibility to ensure that partners are abiding by international humanitarian law. So we'll talk in a moment about international accountability mechanism. I think that this is, in a way, the more effective and critically important element of accountability and ensuring compliance is that states, when they're partnering with non-state actor groups and they're providing these weapons, that they can't just sort of wash their hands of it, send off the weapons and let them go at it. That when they're providing weapons, or when they're providing assistance, when they're providing training, that a critical part of that training is training international and humanitarian law. I know that that is part of what the United States does when it partners with actors around the world. I think it could do even more, frankly, of prioritizing the importance of international humanitarian law compliance with the more than 80 countries that it provides assistance to and that it trains, as well as non-state actor groups that it works with. And that's not just true for the United States, but countries around the world. And many conflict areas, most of the most violent conflict areas are areas where states are, even if they're not directly involved, are involved behind the scenes. I mean, obviously, we know Iran provides a lot of assistance for non-state actor groups. And even states that are providing support for other states. So China's responsibility for Russia's actions in Ukraine, for instance, and the importance of not providing weapons if you know that they're going to be used for international humanitarian law violations. So that's one form of accountability. Obviously, another form is accountability in the courts. We don't have, frankly, many international courts that can do this. In fact, there's really only one that is significant, that has a kind of general jurisdiction over crimes. That's the International Criminal Court. There's been a variety of special courts set up, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, the similar tribunal for Rwanda, and we can go on. These sort of case-specific courts that have been set up over the years, and those are important. But they're expensive to set up, and they can only process a small number of cases. So the ICC plays a critical role in that process. There are over 120 states that are party to the International Criminal Court. The court only has jurisdiction over the nationals of those states and the territory and crimes committed on their territories. And so it has limited jurisdiction, and nonetheless, that jurisdiction has proven to be important. We just saw recently these indictments or arrest warrants that were requested by the prosecutor relating to the war unfolding in Gaza, both against leaders of Hamas and against leaders of Israel. And among the charges that the arrest warrants sought include are charges for violations of international humanitarian law for war crimes. And so that is one form of accountability. But given the lack of the capacity of the courts and the lack of jurisdiction of the courts in many of these instances, while that's important, I think that even more important is states holding other states and their partners and their friends to account and ensuring that they know how to comply with the law, and then ensuring that they do, in fact, comply with the law, and if they don't, withdrawing their support for those actors.
Thank you for all of that and bringing those two pieces together, which I think is really important, and kind of reiterating how they relate to each other. Much of the conversation so far has rightfully focused on protection of civilians, but of course, the Geneva Conventions apply to more than that. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'd love to take an audience question at this point. And we've actually had a couple come in, which, if I may, I'm going to combine relating to the treatment of prisoners of war. And the role of the Geneva Conventions in terms of ensuring their humane treatment and the protection of their rights as prisoners of war. This is coming from a question from Kusumba Bala Srinandak from India, from Central University, and then someone else also from a civilian NGO based in New York City asked a similar question as well. And for that, I'd love to go to Stan first, and then maybe I'll bring others in as well. But can you talk a little bit about the critical importance of the Geneva Conventions when it comes to prisoners of war, and what it is that needs to happen more and happen better from your experiences with respect to that?
Yeah, really difficult. I'm not going to be able to give an answer that makes everyone happy. of course, the Geneva Convention and prisoners of war was combatants. And so if two nations were at war, the people who were captured on the battlefield theoretically were treated a certain way. And sometimes that happened, but certainly more than would have happened without it. We got into this gray area when we started fighting non-state actors, terrorist groups and whatnot. And to be honest, the world has stumbled on that, to include the United States. Because how do you treat a terrorist who is not a member of a state actor and therefore theoretically doesn't follow the laws of armed conflict, therefore isn't in uniform or doesn't do those things we expect, or performs acts which we think are outside of acceptable action? How do you then deal with them? And of course, we ran into that very awkward response to put people at Guantanamo Bay because it wasn't in the continental US, but it was controlled by the US. And to be honest, I don't think we have a good answer, because I had a long time in counterterrorism, and counterterrorism depends upon intelligence. And so defeating terrorist networks requires that you get information, does not require you mistreat people, does not require torture, does not condone that. But understand there is this very difficult tension there. If we go back to the 12th of September, 2001, and all America was poised for follow-on additional attacks that we thought would likely occur, there was this almost frantic effort to figure out how to find out information that would protect other Americans and people around the world. So understand that that dynamic is always going to be there. And so you've got to figure out a way you can put rules. And again, it gets back to discipline. It gets the way you treat people that you capture on the battlefield once they're not a combatant in any way, have got to be ruled by not your anger in the moment, but the discipline of the organization set up by rules that need to survive the harsh light of scrutiny, not just in the moment of passion. But it is hard.
Yeah, and I think it relates also to, Shem, some of the points you were making earlier with respect to on the ground working with armed groups and helping them understand why it's important for them, for their self-interest, but also for the preservation of humanity, despite the incredibly charged environment in which that is taking place. I'd love to turn next to an issue that is extremely timely and that Mariana, over the course of the opening segment, touched on a little bit, and I wanted to get your perspectives on this as well, which is, of course, about the changing nature of warfare and the integration of emerging technologies, such as automated weapon systems, cyber operations, and, of course, artificial intelligence, and how these present both opportunities and challenges for international humanitarian law. So, how can the core tenets of the Geneva Conventions, for example, the principle of distinction, be safeguarded? Do the existing international laws need to be updated or supplemented? And what are you most concerned about? And how do you ensure that IHL is fit for purpose in the age of hybrid warfare? So I know that's a few questions kind of packed in together, and I'll let you decide where you want to zero in depending on your experience and your leadership. And maybe we can go Hichem, then Stan, and then Ona. I'll give you the last word on that question. And I know we're up against time, so we'll try to keep things moving. But over to you first, Hichem.
Thank you, Mariesha. Thanks for the question. I mean, it's an important question, and I think we are facing a shift in the way we wage warfare. The same thing when we introduced, the guns before we had swords. So every time had like new weapons, and I think laws are not something that are stuck. They are evolving, and they should adapt, of course, to our realities. Having said that, we still have, I believe, a solid framework today. I mean, if we just implement, if we just respect, if people are held accountable of their actions vis-a-vis what exists today, we are already making a huge progress. Because of course you have this AI and autonomous weapons, but today the bulk of the destruction, the bulk of the displacements are caused by bombs, by indiscriminate shellings. So I think we have to decide, of course, and to adapt the legal frameworks towards this new technology. I think it's a debate that needs to be open and we need to continue. And the civil society at the field level need to play a role in bringing the data and the information to the policymakers is extremely important. So what we develop in a new legal framework is not detached from realities. I think this is a role that we can play, is as well playing a role by bringing what we see on the ground, the consequences, what we witness as well, to make sure that we have something which is adapted to the reality. Another thing on this particular point, where if I can finish, is these hybrid warfares. We are witnessing as well involvement of new type of actors, private military security companies. It's not really new because, of course, we had Blackwater in the past, but we see now a kind of normalization of this type of actors. There's a privatization of the wars. I mean, you can buy on AliExpress, on Amazon's drones, and then you can use them to kill civilians. It's as easy as that. So I think we need as well to include this component of the privatized warfare, and how to make sure as well that we hold accountable this type of actors, even if it's something that is hard, of course, to engage with in the field. I mean, concretely speaking, we have difficulties as well to engage with them, but it's something that we should continue to do. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that point that you were just saying and about the privatization, and, we certainly know that applies with respect to kinetic warfare, but also cyber warfare and the role, for example, of cyber mercenaries. So I appreciate that point. Stan, let me turn to you next on the questions that I've posed.
Yeah, great. I'll go real quickly and what Hashim said about privatization. I think it's very dangerous because you don't have the same level of accountability and discipline and whatnot. And pretty soon we're going to have private people flying drones into sovereign countries, like people who might want to support Ukraine, and they're doing it from an entire third country. And then we're going to put new dynamics into what the combatants might do in response. I think actually war's gotten better. This sounds terrible because we're close to it now. But if we go back decades, because there was not the ability to do the precision we do now, there was just this abrogation of responsibility. Nowadays, look at how we scrutinize organizations, nations primarily, that use power because they can be more precise. And because they can, I think they have the responsibility to be more precise. Now, some people sort of try to not accept that, but I think that's the reality. And when it's done at its best, what I saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, when we did it well, and we didn't always, we did it with extraordinary sense of accountability. And so I think that bar is raising, and I think that's generally good. And it's hard to say where it's going to go with autonomous weapons, because that's going to happen. In fact, they're already there. And so that's a dynamic that I'm not sure we can control right now.
Indeed, and it definitely raises as many questions, I think, than answers, or maybe more so. But I think that the other point that you made that alludes a little bit to, Ona, what you were talking about earlier, which is it's easy to believe that there hasn't been compliance, that there hasn't been improvement, that there hasn't been responsibility. Certainly when we see the news, when we see, what awful things are happening in so many places, not least Gaza, not least Ukraine, not least many others, but that, that there has been improvements. And so let me turn next to you, Ona, on the question about the changing nature of warfare and emerging technologies.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot to say here, and I'll focus in particular on the technology piece. I would say that the changing technology has many facets. I mean, obviously, we've talked for years now about the rise of cyber operations as both as independent actions, maybe as standalone acts of war, and cyber operations as part of war. And now increasingly, we're talking about AI. We've seen, for instance, in news reports that apparently are credible, that in the early days of the Gaza operation, that Israel was relying on an AI program for a lot of the targeting that was taking place, and that raises real questions about the role of human beings in making decisions, life and death decisions, about targeting. I think Stan's right that technology has the possibility of enabling a more targeted warfare. I think that it can also create the illusion sometimes of having the capacity to be more targeted. And I think your information is only as your targeting is only good as the information that you have. So I've done some work with Azmat Khan, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning series, The Uncounted, for the New York Times. And one thing that we find is that, unfortunately, too often, we use these precision weapons, but we don't always know exactly what we're hitting. And so, I think I agree with Stan that as your capacity to be more targeted grows, your obligation to be more targeted grows as well. But I think we also have to have humility about how well we actually can do that and whether the technology actually allows us to do what we think it can. I think one of the challenges that we face here, look, law is always indeterminate. That is the nature of law. There is no law can encapsulate every possible future situation. And I think we're facing that now with the rise of these new technologies. But what we do when law faces new situations that it hasn't faced before is that we have to interpret the law to apply, the existing law to apply to the current situation. So I agree with Hichem that in many cases, what we're facing is not a lack of law, but the need to actually take the laws and the rules that we have and apply them in the most effective way to the situations that we currently face. And to use the principles, again, these basic principles, distinction, proportionality, precaution, those should be our guiding principles in thinking about how should we be using force in a world where we have access to these new tools, and what kinds of obligations that we have to ensure, and how do we meet those obligations to ensure that civilians are less likely to face the brunt of war in a context in which these wars are increasingly happening in highly urban areas, which are densely populated, where civilians are intertwined. Civilians who are not participating in hostilities are intertwined with civilians who are participating in hostilities and therefore lawful targets. And that is really the challenge that we face at this moment. At this moment in history, is how do we use the technologies that we have to better protect civilians, and how do we not allow technologies to get out of hand in ways that might create the illusion that we're protecting civilians or getting the bad guys that we should be getting, when in fact the reality may be quite different.
Yeah, indeed. And that last point about the application of technologies for the protection of civilians and for humanitarian assistance is really important as well. It's not that, that there isn't enormous potential there as well, and that has a role to play when we think about compliance with IHL as well, of course. Well, I know we've covered so much, and yet it feels like we've barely scratched the surface. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank you, to say a thank you to our panelists for taking the time, for being frank, for sharing your perspectives. As well as a big thanks again to the ICRC and Mariana for supporting today's event and helping us to bring this critical topic to you, our live audience, and during this Protection of Civilians Week. Of course, FP will continue to cover these topics in our reporting, our research, and our events. In July, FP will be hosting a security forum alongside a host of other programming around the 75th NATO Summit in DC. And we will be, in fact, touching on many of the topics that we've been discussing today, whether that's cyber deterrence, protection of civilians, principle of distinction, and so much more. So stay tuned for updates from us, and check out our other upcoming events on these and other issues at foreignpolicy.com/events. Take care and see you soon. Thank you.